How was money used to take over the medical system? In 1910, the Flexner Report was brought in front of Congress, and within 30 years, half the medical schools in America had been shut down. The American Medical Association was given control over college accreditations, and any school that taught alternative forms of medicine, such as homeopathy, would lose their accreditation and lose their funding. From that point forward, petroleum-based medicine dominated the industry. Oh, and the Flexner Report was funded by the Carnegie and the Rockefeller Foundations. You know, the family that controlled all the oil. This is why so many doctors are oblivious to the connection between nutrition and health. It's not prioritized in their training, which is why I wrote the book, You Are What You Eat. And it's why it's so important we teach our kids what lobbyists do and how to track the money, about the revolving door between regulatory agencies and industry, the role lobbyists play in the writing of medical bills, the documented history of kickbacks, and a history of corruption documented by the Department of Justice. Check out my private homeschool community and my books on free speech, healthy living, morality, the Second Amendment, and so much more. AlaskaLearner.com. Put yourself in the shoes of a 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old kid, and you go to school, and your teachers tell you, the principal tells you, all of the authorities tell you that if you get within 6 feet of your friends, if you try to roughhouse, if you try to play, that you or they may fall ill, that you may bring it home to grandma, and who knows, she might have to go to the ER and you might never see her again. Well, that's what they did to children after March of 2020. That's what they taught our kids. And our kids turned on the television and everything they saw was that exact messaging, that you have to cover your face, that if you don't cover your face, you're being irresponsible. And the powers that be, these principals and the superintendents of the school district, they all went along with this, because in school, the number one thing they're teaching young people is to outsource their thinking to authority, and they're training young people to be reactive thinkers. And with what I just covered, with the medical industrial complex, it's all about training young people to be systems thinkers, right? We don't want them to fall prey to the same Hegelian dialectic that so many people fell prey to just one generation ago. I remember when I was a boy and I was in 8th grade. I was in New York. So some context, I lived this stuff. Like, my friends, their fathers were so mangled that they were unrecognizable, right? Like, this was a real thing to me. And I remember being in 8th grade, and I think it was 3rd period, and I was in social studies with Mr. Yassis, who actually had a huge impact on my life. That's how I know the importance of a good teacher. But there I was, 3rd period, and Mr. Yassis gives a very serious announcement. It was 2001, and it wasn't August, and it wasn't October. You could imagine, you probably even know what day it was, but hey, gotta talk around the bots, So it was that day in the year 2001. It was 3rd period, and he gives us this very somber talk and tells us what happened, and they roll a television into the room, and we find out what went down. And I remember going home. They let us out of school early, and I went home, and my family had on the news. My family, I grew up in a right-wing conservative family, but they weren't awake to the world, so they were buying this hook, line, and sinker. And I go home, and the news is on, and the sky is falling, and there's all this fear, we're under attack. And I remember I was outside, and I'll never forget it. I'm playing with my friends on the dead end, as we called it, and all of a sudden, for the first time, because remember, I was right there. For the first time, a fighter jet, after all this time, finally arrived. There was enough time for me to be in school, get the announcement, have everyone's parents come to the school in an organized fashion, pick them up, bring them home, for me to go home, to sit down and watch the news with my parents, to go outside and be with my friends. All of that time elapsed before the United States government could manage to get a fighter jet up in the sky with all of this going on. Man, why don't people talk about that? Because I was just a little kid and, I don't know, putting those dots together. But this fighter jet flew over my head, and it was so low and so fast that you could feel the ground rumble. You could feel the ground shake. And I remember, because there was this fear in me, I had the warmest feeling, one of the warmest feelings in my life, that all of a sudden I knew we were safe because the good guys had arrived. And with those fighter jets in the sky, we didn't have to worry about anything else happening in the sky above us. And I remember when all that happened, it's actually kind of crazy to think about how right after that, how unified the country was. Remember, in October of that year, the New York Yankees, you wonder how much of this is planned, I don't know, but the New York Yankees were in the World Series. And George W. Bush, the Republican president in Democrat leftist New York City, goes to throw out the first pitch. And I don't know if I've ever heard such a loud standing ovation for a political figure or anyone. Go back and watch the video. It's really amazing how unified the country was, how much they had everyone in that reactive brain, how patriotic the country was. By the way, I think it was a good thing that people were patriotic, as long as they're taught to question. But in schools, they're not teaching young people to question. And you think about how united the country was, how ready they were to go to war in the Middle East, how ready they were for Afghanistan, how ready they were for Iraq, even though they didn't have anything to do with the actual attacks on that day. The Patriot Act, how blind Americans were to what was actually in it. And of course, now the Patriot Act, right? You want to talk about things, a teachable moment. It was the justification used to target the people who, we'll say, participated in, it wasn't December 6th, it wasn't February 6th, I don't know, it was one of those months, you know, it has a name, but those people who were targeted under the justification of, the government was able to access their information through the Patriot Act, right? So you see how all of this stuff comes together. But of course, at the time, there was the Hegelian dialectic. There was a problem, this attack. There was a reaction, everyone being afraid and feeling very patriotic. And there was a solution. The Patriot Act, and of course, the invasion, the launching point of the American empire really getting a stronghold in the Middle East. Problem, reaction, solution. Well, with everything that went on in March of 2020, that's really the same thing they were going for, right? It was the same, we have this problem, your reaction, everyone's going to be very afraid, and the solution is, well, we know the solution they rolled out. It hit people like a tiny little prick in the arm. It's like the Joker, like a tiny little prick in the arm. That was the solution. And that was, along with basic deterioration of our God-given rights and the ability for the government to track people, right? I mean, you have members of the Department of Health we're actually doing tracing of people that allegedly, came down with this affliction. I really am getting good at talking around this stuff. So it was the same idea, though: problem, reaction, solution. And you see how the system teaches young people in this fear-like state to be these reactive thinkers. But we as parents want to teach our children what the school system should be teaching them: to be systems thinkers, to understand the interconnectivity between government, industry, and finance, and studying the medical industrial complex, especially in the light of everything that happened. Because no matter what level you're at with talking to your kids about what occurred, and based on their age, that should be a different talk. And no matter what, you never, ever, ever let them see you afraid. Even if you never allow your kids to see you afraid. You never allow your children to see you unhopeful, ever in this life. I can't tell you how important that is. Your children need to have their light, that spark, that childlike innocence, that angelic nature, that hope for the world. That is so important. And if they lose that, it's because they're seeing you in a state of despair. We never allow our children to get into that. But no matter where they are, you can teach them to understand the world from this systems perspective through a study of the medical industrial complex. So there's a few things you want them to look into. You want your children to learn what a lobbyist does. There's a great 60 Minutes interview by, and I know the media sucks, but sometimes they do a good job, usually because they're trying to nail someone else politically and they let some truth out. There's a 60 Minutes interview with Jack Abramoff. He was a lobbyist and he went to jail for a few years, came out, wrote a book, and kind of spilled the beans on what he actually did as a lobbyist. And let's just say private jets, 5-star restaurants, and football games, right? Long story short, go watch the interview. 60 Minutes, Jack Abramoff. It's a great place to start with what lobbyists actually do. Then you want to teach your children how to track lobbying money. So you could have them go to opensecrets.org, sort by lobbying by industry, and just go back 20 years and see which industry spends more money lobbying Congress than any other industry nearly every year for the last 20 years. And of course, that will be, I should have been a pharma. See what I did there? Big, yep. Yeah, I'm still doing it with the talk around. So you have them look into that. Then you have them look into the relationship between lobbyists and how medical bills are written up. And what you'll find is, I'm kind of jumping topics here, they'll get into lobbying, they'll get into the revolving door, right? The revolving door is where congressional members of Congress and congressional staffers, especially the staffers that work under the congressman, they get high-paying jobs working for big corporations, Johnson and Johnson, you guys get it, right? And then the former members of these corporations, they become regulators at the FDA and all of these different government bureaucracies. This is the revolving door of corruption. What people don't talk about is one of the biggest problems is actually with the congressional staffers. Because these congressional staffers, they're making, just imagine $40,000 a year or $60,000 a year. Let's say they're making $60,000 a year, but they have a influential position with a congressman. Well, they're told that if this one provision is added into this medical bill, right? In 3 years, when you're done working for that congressman, we will have a job waiting for you at triple your salary. So now you're taking someone who's making $60,000 a year, which in this world, that's just getting by. And now you're saying 3 years guaranteed, you're making $180,000 a year. And how these things get slipped into medical bills, where the lobbyists will actually write the bills themselves and then give them to the staffers bring them to the congressman, and then they get passed along, right? So you have the lobbying money, you have the revolving door, you have how bills are written. You can get into kickbacks kickbacks and incentives that pharmacists receive as it relates to the sales of, remember, there was the opioid crisis in the United States of America, right? Like, all of this stuff is well documented, and you could teach your kids about that by actually having them having them read the official press releases from the Department of Justice about fines that these companies have received. And like the Sackler family, for example, I think $4 billion in fines for their role in the opioid crisis. Well, there's a Department of Justice press release all about that. And you could read about this long history of corruption, and then you get all the way back into the history of that system, and you have them read the Flexner Report, or parts of the Flexner Report. They don't have to read hundreds of pages, but parts of the Flexner Report, which was actually brought in front of Congress in 1910, I believe, and it was used to give the American Medical Association control over college accreditations at the time in the field of medicine, right? And within 30 years of the American Medical Association having this power over college accreditations, money, funding, half the medical schools in the United States of America had been closed down. If you were teaching homeopathy, if you were teaching naturopathy, you weren't going to have that accreditation. So those schools were closed down, and only the schools that were teaching petroleum-based, pill-based medicine remained open. Well, you fast forward 5, 6, 7 generations, that explains why so many people in that field, so many professionals in that field, look at you sideways when you say, well, should I be doing anything with my nutrition, right? I mean, imagine these patients who go into a medical office and they have, a tumor or whatever it might be, and they get certain treatments, and their doctor says, yeah, just have a bunch of candy, a bunch of sugar, a bunch of preservatives, and say, well, shouldn't I be doing something for diet? By the way, for those who watch these videos, this is not advice. I'm not giving anyone advice. I'm just pointing out there is historical record of how these professionals are trained, and it is pertinent to talk about their training. Now, I always say that you should seek the advice of a professional, and whatever, issue you have, you should seek the advice of a licensed professional. So just to make that clear. But so all of this stuff happened, and by looking into how these issues, the history, I didn't get to the best part. So the Flexner Report was funded by, this is where tracking the money comes in, the Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations. And of course, Rockefeller, petroleum-based medicine, you drill for petroleum, right? So understanding the interconnectivity between government, industry, and finance allows you to start piecing together the world and discerning the world in a way in which you're asking the right questions and you understand what's happening in front of you. So you're not that reactive thinker. You're a systems thinker, and you can make up your own mind and start to figure things out on your own. And that's where we have to get as a culture, and that's how we have to educate our children. All of this is actually based off of a unit study on the medical industrial complex that I created for our students. I love to create unit studies on these complexes, these industrial complexes, to teach young people how all of this stuff is intertwined, how it's connected, so that they can really improve their thinking abilities. Because ultimately you could tell someone what to think, but it's the old saying, I could catch you a fish, but if I teach you how to fish, you eat for a lifetime. I could tell you what to think, but if I teach you how to think, well, you'll figure the rest out. In fact, I tell people all the time that my students, the next generation, are going to do greater things than I have done or ever will do, because I had to figure this stuff out. But the next generation is going to know how to think. They're going to be taught how to think from the jump. And I can't wait to see the things that they achieve. I can't wait to see the things that they come up with and they do, because they're going to have the skills, they're going to have the knowledge, and they'll have every opportunity in the world to, from a very young age, they're going to have the financial literacy, the entrepreneurial experience, the know-how, the mindset, the thinking ability. The next generation. And so I always tell people, like, oh, how can you raise a kid in this world? Like, this is the best time ever to be a young person. Like, one, tough times make tough people. So we just went through some tough times, and now we as parents are adjusting, and our children are going to be the byproduct of that. They're going to be tough. They're going to be strong. They're raised by homesteaders. They're raised by people that grow their own food. They're raised by people that are frontiersmen, entrepreneurs, rugged individualists. All right, guys, classicallearner.com.